Imagine a 12-year-old boy, small and fragile, locked inside one of the most brutal prisons in the country. No childhood, no second chances, only survival. His crime? Unforgivable. His punishment? Beyond cruel. Inside these cold, unforgiving walls, he is not treated as a child, but as an animal. The guards take pleasure in his suffering. The inmates see him as nothing more than a target, and the world outside forgets he even exists. Electric shocks, brutal beatings, starvation. Every day is a new kind of torture. How does a child survive such inhumanity? Or does he? This is not just a story of punishment. It's a story of a system that failed, of a boy who was broken beyond repair. And in the end, one question remains. Was justice truly served, or was this nothing more than a slow execution arrest of the dangerous child prisoner? It was a crime that shook the entire city. No one could believe that a 12-year-old boy was capable of such a horrifying act. The media swarmed the streets, reporters eager to uncover every detail. Some called him a monster, others questioned how a child could descend into such darkness. The police arrived at the boy's home late at night. Sirens wailed, red and blue lights flashing against the walls of the small broken-down house where he lived. His mother, a frail woman with tired eyes, pleaded with the officers, insisting her son was just a child. But the evidence was undeniable: bloody fingerprints, a weapon hidden under his bed, and the silent, haunting stare of the boy himself. He did not cry. He did not scream. He simply stood there as the handcuffs snapped around his small wrists. As he was taken away, the neighbors whispered among themselves. Some pitied him, believing he was a victim of a cruel world. Others shuddered, convinced that something evil lurked within him. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Arresting a child for such a crime was not something they did often, but this was no ordinary child. At the police station, the interrogation room felt cold and lifeless. The boy sat on a steel chair, his feet barely touching the floor. The detective, a man who had seen criminals of all kinds, found himself unsettled. Most children in this situation would be sobbing, begging to go home. But this boy, he was calm, too calm. The courtroom was packed when the trial began. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, cameras flashed, and murmurs filled the air. The judge, an older man with a heavy heart, studied the boy in silence. There were debates. Should a child face the same punishment as an adult? Was he truly aware of the gravity of his crime? But when the final verdict was announced, the world gasped. The court showed no mercy. The boy, despite his young age, was sentenced to a high-security prison. The decision sent shockwaves through the nation. Was justice truly served, or had they just condemned a child to a fate worse than death, a horrific life in prison? The iron gates slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate. A 12-year-old boy, small and fragile, now found himself inside one of the most dangerous prisons in the country. He was surrounded by men who had committed unspeakable crimes, murderers, gang leaders, and violent offenders who had long forgotten what mercy felt like. Here, there was no childhood, no second chances, only survival. As he stepped into the cold, dimly lit corridors, the inmates watched him with curiosity and amusement. Some whispered, others laughed. A few saw him as nothing more than a weakling, an easy target for their twisted entertainment. The guards, instead of protecting him, treated him with equal contempt. To them, he was not a child. He was just another criminal, another burden on the system. His first night was a nightmare. The thin mattress offered no comfort. The darkness was suffocating, and the distant screams of other prisoners echoed through the halls. Sleep was impossible. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. But in the cafeteria, he quickly learned that food was another battle. The strongest took what they wanted, and he was left with scraps. If he was lucky, days turned into weeks, and the cruelty only worsened. The guards used him as an example, punishing him for the smallest mistakes. A missed step, a delayed response, everything resulted in pain. The other prisoners saw this and joined in, some out of amusement, others to establish dominance. They beat him, humiliated him, and made him question whether he would ever leave this place alive. But the worst part wasn't the beatings, it was the loss of innocence. He had once been a boy, someone who might have still had a future. Now he was learning to survive in a world where kindness was weakness and cruelty was law. He stopped crying. He stopped pleading. His heart hardened, and his eyes lost their light. In this hellish prison, he was no longer a child. He was becoming something else, something darker. The world had given up on him, and soon he would give up on the world. Brutal punishments, electric shocks, and torture. The boy had thought the beatings were the worst of it. He was wrong. In this prison, punishment was not just a consequence, it was a spectacle. The guards relished every opportunity to break him further, to remind him that he was powerless, that he did not belong to himself anymore. Even the smallest mistake, failing to respond fast enough, dropping his food tray, or even looking a guard in the eye for too long, was enough to warrant suffering beyond imagination. One day, he hesitated for just a moment when ordered to clean the floor of the prison's common area. It was nothing, just a brief pause, a second of exhaustion. But in this place, hesitation was rebellion. The guards dragged him from the room, their faces twisted in cruel amusement. The other prisoners watched in silence. Some pitied him, others smirked, knowing all too well what awaited him. He was taken to a secluded chamber, dimly lit and reeking of sweat and fear. A heavy metal chair sat in the center, its armrests fitted with thick leather straps. He struggled, but his small frame was no match for the guards. They forced him down, strapping his arms and legs tightly. Then, the machine hummed to life. At first, it was just a faint vibration, a warning of the agony to come. Then, the pain hit like a lightning bolt ripping through his body. His muscles seized, his back arched violently, and a scream tore from his throat, a sound so raw and desperate that it should have melted even the coldest hearts. But there was no mercy here. The guards watched, their expressions indifferent, as the boy convulsed under the relentless waves of electricity. His vision blurred, his mind teetered between consciousness and oblivion, and yet it did not stop. The shocks came in bursts, giving him just enough time to gasp for air before another jolt stole it away. Somewhere in the depths of his agony, he heard laughter. The cruelty of it burned deeper than the electricity itself. This was not punishment. This was entertainment. When it was finally over, his small body collapsed, trembling uncontrollably. His wrists and ankles were raw from struggling against the restraints, his throat hoarse from screaming. But the worst pain wasn't physical. It was the realization that this was his life now. That this could happen again. Anytime. For any reason. As the guards unstrapped him and dragged his limp body back to his cell, he no longer felt like a child. He felt like something broken, something that could never be fixed. And for the first time, he wondered if death would be kinder than survival. Is there no mercy in this cruel world? Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The boy had stopped keeping track of time. Each day was just another cycle of suffering, another test of how much pain a human body could endure before it broke completely. He no longer questioned why. He no longer hoped for kindness. In this prison, there was no such thing as mercy. But there were moments, rare, fleeting moments, when he saw glimpses of something different. A few prisoners, hardened men with years of violence behind them, looked at him with something almost like regret. They had seen monsters, real monsters, yet they knew the boy was not one of them. One of these men was an old inmate named Ramirez, a lifer who had once been feared but now spent his days in silence. He had watched the boy suffer, had seen the way the guards took pleasure in his pain. One evening, when the boy returned to his cell, barely able to walk from the latest beating, Ramirez placed a small piece of bread beside him. It wasn't much, but it was an unspoken gesture. I see you. I know your pain. Another was Malik, a towering man with a past filled with violence. He never spoke much, but one night when another inmate tried to steal the boy's food, Malik intervened. He didn't say anything, just stared until the attacker backed away. The boy never thanked him, and Malik never expected him to, but kindness, no matter how small, was powerless in this place. The guards made sure of that. Anyone who showed sympathy toward the boy risked becoming a target themselves. Ramirez was punished for offering food, forced into solitary confinement for days. Malik was beaten by the guards under the excuse of breaking the rules. Mercy was not welcome here. The boy saw this and understood the truth. This was not about reform. It was not about justice. This prison existed to break people, to strip them of whatever humanity they had left. Lying in his cold, dark cell, his body bruised and aching, the boy finally accepted it. There was no mercy in this world, and if kindness could not survive here, then neither could he, not as the person he once was. Something inside him hardened that night. If the world wanted him to be a monster, perhaps that was exactly what he would become. The final scream, the child prisoner's fate. The boy had endured more pain than most men twice his age. The endless beatings, the electric shocks, the starvation. Each day in prison was another test of his will to live. But even the strongest can only take so much before something inside them shatters beyond repair. One night, the guards decided to teach him one final lesson. They dragged him out of his cell, his frail body barely able to resist. He didn't scream anymore, not at first. He had learned that it never made a difference. But when they strapped him down once again, when the electric current surged through his small frame, his body betrayed him. The prison walls trembled with the sound of his agony. This time, the pain felt different, deeper, endless. His vision blurred, his chest tightened, and for the first time he truly believed he would not wake up again. Somewhere in the prison, Ramirez sat in his cell, his hands clenched into fists. Malik paced restlessly, his jaw tight with anger. They had seen men die in this place, but this was different. This was a child, one who should never have been here in the first place. Then, silence. The boy's body slumped, motionless. The guards checked for a pulse. For a moment it seemed as if their cruelty had finally claimed him. But then, one ragged breath. He was still alive. Barely. The guards laughed. "He's tougher than we thought," one of them muttered. But they didn't take him to the infirmary. They simply unstrapped him, dumped his unconscious body on the cold prison floor, and walked away. Days later, news of his condition leaked to the outside world. Human rights activists, lawyers, and journalists demanded answers. How had a 12-year-old been sentenced to such a place? How had the system allowed such brutality? But the prison warden denied everything. The government turned a blind eye, and the boy. Some say he never recovered, that his mind and body were too broken to survive much longer. Others believe he escaped, vanishing into the night, a ghost forged in suffering. But one thing was certain, his story would haunt the world forever. Was this justice? Or had they simply turned an innocent child into the very monster they feared?